There's no denying at this point that Steven Spielberg is one of the greatest directors to have ever lived. I even dedicated a whole video to explaining the more obscure reasons why he's such a great director, which you can find a link in the description too. And his understanding of filmmaking, and not to mention audience attitudes, is perhaps best evident in one of the first movies he ever did, Jaws, to the point that it's often said to be one of the few instances where the movie adaptation was actually better than the book it was based on. And it's not without reason either, because simply put, the movie may have changed a lot from the original novel, but they were all changes that helped improve the story rather than take away from it. And today, I'd like to try and explain how exactly the changes Steven Spielberg made to the novel's story allowed it to become the classic everybody knows and loves today. And needless to say, there will be spoilers ahead for both Jaws and one or two other movies I've mentioned. So in case there's something you've been meaning to see and don't want to know how it ends, you might just want to keep on the lookout. You have been warned. Alright, so to put it very simply, the book and movie versions of Jaws don't actually have all that much in common when all's said and done. Beyond the basic plot of three different men setting out to kill a shark after it terrorizes an island's populated beaches, the two are very different in terms of characters and tone. Such things as "you're gonna need a bigger boat," the famous Indianapolis speech, and the shark's death are all things that were invented for the movie and can be found nowhere in the book. While conversely, such things as Hooper having an affair with Brody's wife, the mob forcing the mayor to keep the beaches open, and Hooper's death are all things that were in the novel but left out of the film. And there's a very good reason for both these omissions and additions, which can be perhaps best summed up in a quote by Steven Spielberg himself, which is that he found all the characters in the book to be so unlikable that he found himself rooting for the shark to eat them all instead. And that is the most important rule of storytelling that must never be broken. As a man who's actually written books myself, I have always maintained that the one crucial aspect of storytelling that must always be followed is that if a writer intends for the audience to root for a specific character, then that character must be written to be sympathetic. Now, I'm no expert in these matters. I'm simply an amateur writer at the end of the day. But I do have enough experience to say with complete certainty that if a writer simply presents a character as good or bad, or the hero or villain, without their actions backing it up, the audience will get angry. If you're writing a story, you have to be prepared to back up any claim you make about a character with actions on the character's part. Otherwise, it will never turn out well. Again, as a man who's written books, I speak from personal experience when I say that. And it's for this exact reason that writers will often go out of their way to make their characters sympathetic even when they wouldn't normally be presented that way. Even in prison movies, the people running the prison will usually be presented as brutal and corrupt in order to make the criminals, who are often the main character and thus who the writer wants the audience to be rooting for, sympathetic. But I already dedicated a whole separate video to that, which you can also find a link in the description to in case you're curious. Now, at this point you might be wondering, what does all of this have to do with Jaws? That the book did not do its job of getting the reader to sympathize with its characters. And indeed, even apart from what Spielberg said, one of the biggest criticisms often lobbied against the novel is that there's really nobody to root for because everybody's a big jerk. And Steven Spielberg smartly went out of his way to avoid this when making the movie adaptation. That's why he removed the subplot of Hooper's affair to make him more likable by default. as well as the mob pressuring the mayor to keep the beaches open, and instead presents him as a man in denial who eventually comes to feel extremely guilty over how much tragedy his ignorance has caused, as well as adds things like Brody and his son's interaction at the dinner table, or Hooper offering him a pretzel at one point. None of that serves the plot in any way, but it helps to humanize the characters and easily sell them as good people that the audience can root for against the monstrous shark. And that's not even getting into what the Indianapolis speech ends up doing for Quint's character. In other words, Steven Spielberg understood exactly what was wrong with the original novel and went out of his way to fix it in the movie. Because no matter how one feels about Jaws, one cannot deny that the characters are extremely likable. Due to a combination of Spielberg's writing, the omission of certain actions from the book, and the actors' performances, the story is turned from one where the shark is the most likable character to the much more intended reaction of the audience cheering the characters on as they try to defeat the shark, who's most definitely the undisputed villain of the film. In the movie, the shark becomes the most unlikable character due to his viewing people as nothing but food, and going as far as to toy with the characters when they try to stop him. And that's exactly how it should be. And that's why the movie works a lot better than the book does. The characters are actually likable in the film and easy to root for, while the novel seems to go out of its way to paint everybody as an unrepentant jerk. So why should the reader care about what happens to them? And if for some reason you believe I'm wrong about this observation, just take a look at the reaction many had to another shark movie that wasn't so careful about how likable its characters were, Deep Blue Sea. Now, I already went over how badly the writers screwed up here in a separate video, which you can also find the link in the description too. So all I'll say is, people are still debating to this day over whether or not Susan McAllister is a sympathetic character and whether she deserved to die at the end or should have lived as originally intended. Because no matter what stance you or I personally have, there is somebody who will feel differently about it. And such a divisive and often hostile response from audiences can only come about due to bad writing. And honestly, it's amazing how many storytellers get such a basic concept wrong. If you want a character to be likable or unlikable, just have them do and not do the appropriate things to back it up. And the audience generally won't have a problem with them. That's what I did when I wrote my books, and that's what Steven Spielberg did with Jaws, and the results speak for themselves. Because even in a case like Quint, he may be a bit of a jerk and a nutcase, but he's still likable enough that you'd never find anybody trying to argue that he deserved to die at the end, especially in such a brutal fashion. So as I said at the beginning, Steven Spielberg is one director who knew exactly what he was doing, and it shows in the writing behind Jaws, only his second film as a director, as he managed to completely salvage the story of the novel so that the audience would root for the characters instead of the shark. Because as I just got through saying, that is apt to happen more often than one might think when characters' actions don't back up what the writer claims about them. As I've stressed in other videos, audiences are very particular when it comes to viewing characters in a good or bad light, and will take every opportunity to argue that they don't deserve the designation the writer gave them. But Spielberg was able to do such a good job of rewriting the characters from the book that nobody would argue that they shouldn't be seen the way the narrative says they should, which at the end of the day should be every writer's chief goal. And, in addition to a few other changes made between the movie and novel, that's why it's almost universally agreed that the film is superior to the book, because the story is told in a much more compelling way. To the point that I can honestly say that if an aspiring writer wanted to get a handle on how characters should be written to ensure their likability, Jaws would be one of the best films to look to, which only speaks to just how far removed it really is from the original novel. Alright, I think that pretty much ends this video. So now it's your turn to tell me. Do you believe that unlike its source material, the movie adaptation of Jaws does a perfect job of making its characters sympathetic so that the audience wants to root for them over the shark? Or do you think I'm giving the film way too much credit? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And please keep in mind that you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video if you don't want to. You can feel absolutely any way you'd like about both the movie and book versions of Jaws, or any other movies brought up here, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I very appreciate all of it. And I hope to see you all next time.